You should have left her there to die." The thought came cold and precise as the wind cut across the open road, driving needles of ice against Duke Alexander Blackwood's face while his horse shifted beneath him, restless under the storm that had swallowed the countryside for miles. Visibility no more than a few feet, the world reduced to white chaos and the hollow echo of his own breath. And yet he had stopped, against instinct, against reason, because something lay ahead in the snow, something that did not belong to the stillness of death but resisted it, faintly, stubbornly, a dark shape half buried where the drift had begun to rise like a frozen grave. He narrowed his eyes, urging the horse one step closer, then another, the sound of hooves muted beneath inches of fresh snow until he saw it clearly, a woman, her form slight, her coat torn and dusted white, strands of pale hair clinging to her face where frost had settled, and beneath her, a stain spreading slowly. Too dark, too warm against the endless cold, he exhaled. Once, sharp, calculating, already turning the horse aside. This was not his concern, not his burden. People disappeared in storms like this all the time. The land swallowed them without memory, and he had long ago learned not to interfere with what fate had already claimed. But then the wind shifted, just enough to reveal something glinting at her throat, a small object catching what little light remained, unnatural against the snow, and his gaze locked onto it before he could stop himself. Something about it wrong, or perhaps too familiar. His jaw tightened, fingers curling against the reins as the horse stamped impatiently, waiting for command, and still he hesitated, the storm pressing in, time thinning with every second. She would not last long. That much was certain. Her breath, if it still existed, was invisible now, swallowed by the cold. And yet when he forced himself to look away, to choose the path he had always chosen, something shifted behind him, subtle, fragile, as if the world itself resisted his departure. He cursed under his breath and swung down from the saddle, boots sinking deep into the snow as he crossed the distance in a few strides, each step deliberate, unwilling, until he stood over her, the silence louder here, broken only by the wind tearing past his ears. He crouched, gloved hand hovering for a moment before finally touching her shoulder, light, testing, as if she might vanish at contact. But she didn't, and when he turned her slightly, enough to see her face, her lashes trembled, barely, a flicker so faint it could have been imagined. But it wasn't, because in the next second her eyes opened, not wide, not fully, just enough to reveal a muted gray that found him without fear, without pleading, without anything at all except a quiet recognition that made his chest tighten in a way he did not understand. She didn't speak, didn't reach, didn't even seem to realize the edge she stood upon. And that was what unsettled him most. Not desperation, not weakness, but the absence of both. As if she had already accepted the end and was merely waiting for it to arrive, his hand stilled against her shoulder, the storm howling louder as if urging him to leave, to let the snow finish what it had begun. But instead he slid one arm beneath her, lifting her weight with surprising ease, her body cold even through layers of fabric, her head falling lightly against his chest as though she belonged there. And in that moment, with her breath barely brushing the front of his coat and that strange glint at her throat pressed close between them, Alexander Blackwood understood something he had not felt in years, that this was not chance, not inconvenience, but the beginning of something that would not release him, no matter how much he might wish it to. The ride back to Blackwood Manor felt longer than any distance he had crossed before, though it could not have been more than 2 miles through the storm, the wind clawing at his cloak as he held her steady against him, one arm firm around her shoulders while the other guided the reins with practiced control, her weight barely there yet impossible to ignore, as if every shallow breath she took echoed against his chest, uneven and fragile. He could feel the cold that had seeped into her, not just from the snow, but from something deeper, something that did not belong to this night alone. The horse struggled against the rising drifts, each step slower, more deliberate, until the distant outline of the manor finally emerged through the white haze, its tall stone walls cutting into the storm like a silent sentinel, windows dimly lit with flickering candlelight that barely touched the darkness surrounding it. And as they approached, the heavy gates creaked open at his command, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the wind. Servants, appeared in the doorway, their silhouettes rigid with surprise, none daring to speak as they saw what he carried. A stranger, a woman, and in his arms, something no one in this house had witnessed in years, hesitation from their master. He dismounted without a word, boots striking the stone with a dull echo, and walked past them as though the storm still followed him inside. Melting snow dripping from his coat onto the polished floor. The warmth of the manor rising to meet them, yet doing little to soften the tension that settled in the air. "Prepare a room," he said at last, his voice low but absolute. And the staff moved instantly. Though their glances lingered, questions unspoken, he did not look at them, his focus fixed only on the faint rise and fall beneath his arm, the steady battle she fought without knowing. He carried her through corridors lined with shadow and candlelight, past portraits that watched in silence, until he reached a chamber rarely used, a room meant for guests who never came. He placed her gently upon the bed, the contrast stark, her pale form against dark linen, her hair damp with melting snow, strands clinging to her skin, and for a moment he simply stood there, watching, as though waiting for proof that she would remain, that she would not disappear the moment he released her. A physician was summoned, hands careful, movements precise, instructions given in hushed tones while the fire was stoked higher, blankets drawn close, warmth slowly reclaiming what the cold had tried to take. Alexander stepped back, yet he did not leave, his presence anchored near the edge of the room as the storm raged beyond the walls, his gaze drifting once more to the object. At her throat, now clearer in the candlelight, a small pendant, simple in design yet unmistakable in its detail. His expression tightened, something distant flickering across his features, a memory not yet formed into thought. And as the physician spoke of rest and uncertainty, of waiting through the night, Alexander barely heard him, because all he could see was the way her fingers curled slightly against the fabric, as if holding onto something unseen, something beyond this room. And for the first time in years, he did not retreat into the safety of indifference. Instead, he remained, standing in the quiet glow of candlelight, watching over a stranger who had already begun to unravel the order of his world. The night did not quiet. It only settled into a deeper kind of silence, one that pressed against the walls of Blackwood Manor while the storm continued its restless assault outside. And within that silence, the rhythm of her breathing became the only thing Alexander could not ignore. Slow, uneven, but still there. He stood near the window at first, hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid as if distance alone could restore the order he had lost the moment he chose to carry her inside. Yet his gaze returned to her again and again, drawn without permission, as though something unseen tethered him to the fragile rise and fall beneath the blankets. Hours passed without measure. The candles burned lower, their flames trembling with each draft that slipped through the ancient stone, and still she did not wake. The physician had long since withdrawn after offering cautious words that meant nothing and everything at once, leaving only the quiet presence of the housekeeper who moved, with careful steps, adjusting the fire, replacing damp cloths with fresh warmth, never speaking unless addressed, and even then only in whispers that seemed too loud for the stillness of the room. "She is holding on," the woman had said at one point, her voice gentle but certain, and Alexander had given no response, because holding on was not the same as returning. And he had learned long ago that some battles were fought in silence where no one else could reach. He shifted at last, stepping closer to the bed, the soft creak of the floor beneath his boots marking his movement. And for a moment he simply looked at her, not as a problem to be solved or a responsibility to be dismissed, but as something he did not yet understand. Her features had softened in the warmth, the harshness of the cold retreating just enough to reveal a quiet strength beneath, something unyielding despite the state she had been found in, and it unsettled him more than any plea for help could have. His gaze dropped once more to the pendant resting against her collarbone, now free of frost, its surface catching the dim light of the candles in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if it wanted to be seen. He reached out without fully realizing it, his fingers hovering just above it before finally brushing the edge. A simple touch, yet the reaction was immediate, not from the object but from her, a faint movement, a shift in her breath, and then her hand, cold still but no longer lifeless, closed weakly around his wrist, the contact so unexpected that it held him still. Her eyes did not open, not yet, but her lips parted slightly, as if forming words that never came. And in that fragile moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with the storm or the circumstances that had brought her here, something quieter, deeper, a recognition that existed beyond reason. Alexander did not pull away, though every instinct urged him to reclaim the distance he had always maintained. Instead, he remained where he was, allowing the faint pressure of her hand to anchor him in place, as if she had claimed a part of his attention that could not be given back. And when her grip loosened once more, her hand falling gently back against the blankets, he exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, the room returning to stillness around them. Yet nothing felt the same, because now there was no denying it. Whatever had begun in the storm had followed him here, and it was not leaving. Morning did not arrive with light, but with a slow fading of darkness, the storm outside retreating into a distant whisper as pale gray filtered through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor. And still Alexander had not left the room. Though the candles had burned down to their final inches and the fire had been fed twice through the long hours of the night, he stood now at the edge of the bed once more, his presence quieter, less guarded than before, as if the silence between them had worn away something he could not name. Her breathing had steadied, no longer fragile but still delicate, each rise of her chest a quiet defiance against the cold that had nearly claimed her. The housekeeper entered softly, pausing just inside the doorway with a glance that carried both relief and careful curiosity. "She will wake soon, Your Grace," she said, her voice measured, respectful. Yet there was something else beneath it, something observant, as though she too sensed that this moment held more weight than it should. Alexander gave a slight nod, dismissing her without words, and when the door closed once more, the room returned to its stillness. But it was no longer the same stillness as before. It felt expectant, as if waiting. And then it happened, subtle at first, a shift in her expression, the faint tightening of her fingers against the fabric, and then her lashes moved, slowly, uncertainly, as though even waking required effort she was not sure she possessed. Alexander did not step back, though instinct urged him to create distance. Instead, he remained where he was, watching as her eyes opened. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to meet the world again, her gaze unfocused at first, drifting across the unfamiliar ceiling, the shadows, the flicker of fading candlelight, until at last it found him, and stilled. There was no fear in it, no sudden panic at being in a stranger's room, only a quiet confusion, a searching, as though she was trying to place him in a memory that did not quite exist. Her lips parted slightly, her voice, when it came, barely more than a breath, fragile but steady. "Where?" The word faded before it could complete itself, her strength not yet returned to carry it further. Alexander studied her for a moment before answering, his voice low, controlled, yet softer than it had been in years. "You are safe." The words settled into the space between them, simple, but they seemed to reach her in a way nothing else could, because her expression shifted, not into relief, not into gratitude, but into something quieter, something deeper, as if safety was not a concept she trusted easily. Her gaze lingered on him, searching again, and this time there was something else beneath it, a recognition not of who he was, but of what he had done. Though she did not speak it, her hand moved slightly, instinctively, as though reaching for something, and when her fingers brushed against the pendant at her throat, she stilled, her grip tightening just enough to reveal its importance. Alexander's eyes followed the movement, the same unease stirring beneath his composure, that small object once again drawing his attention, pulling at something buried, something unresolved, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, charged not with discomfort, but with the weight of something unspoken, until at last, she looked back at him, her voice still faint but steadier now. "You should not have." She paused, as if the thought itself was too heavy to finish, but he understood it anyway. The implication, the unasked question, why? And for the first time since he had found her in the snow, Alexander had no answer that satisfied even himself. His jaw tightened slightly, his gaze holding hers with quiet intensity. "And yet I did," he replied, the words simple, final, leaving no room for argument. But even as he spoke them, he knew something had shifted beyond his control, because the moment her eyes softened, just slightly, as if accepting that answer without fully believing it, he realized that whatever had begun in the storm had not ended with her survival. It had only just begun. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt fragile, as if a single word spoken too quickly might fracture whatever invisible thread had begun to form between them. Clara's gaze drifted from his face only briefly, as though the effort of holding it there required more strength than she possessed. Yet even as her eyes moved, her awareness of him did not fade. It lingered in the stillness of the room, in the quiet rhythm of her breath, in the way her fingers remained curled loosely around the pendant at her throat, as if anchoring herself to something deeper than memory. Alexander turned slightly then, not to leave, but to reclaim a measure of distance, his posture shifting back into something more familiar, more controlled. Yet it was a control that now felt deliberate rather than instinctive, as though it had to be chosen rather than simply exist. He moved toward the window, the pale morning light revealing the aftermath of the storm, the world outside buried beneath a thick, undisturbed layer of snow that stretched for miles in every direction, isolating the manor completely. There would be no travel today, no interruptions, nothing to pull him away from what he had brought inside these walls. And the realization settled heavily in his chest. Behind him, Clara shifted slightly, the soft rustle of fabric drawing his attention back despite himself. She attempted to sit, the effort, small but determined, her hand pressing weakly against the mattress as if testing her own strength. And for a moment he watched without intervening, something in him wanting to see if she would ask, if she would reach. But she did neither. Her jaw tightened faintly as she steadied herself, managing only the slightest lift before the strain became evident. And then, without a word, his hand was there, firm but careful, guiding her back against the pillows before the effort could cost her more. Then she realized. Her breath caught softly at the contact, not in fear, but in recognition of the quiet authority in it. Her eyes lifted to his again, searching, questioning, yet still holding that same absence of expectation that unsettled him more than any demand could have. "You should rest," he said, his voice even, though there was something beneath it now, something less distant. She studied him for a moment longer, as if weighing the truth of his words against her own instinct, and then she nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate, her hand loosening slightly from the pendant, though not fully releasing it, as if some part of her still needed its reassurance. The fire crackled softly in the corner, the warmth settling deeper into the room, and with it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, the sharp edge of survival giving way to something quieter, something uncertain. Clara's gaze drifted once more, not to the walls or the unfamiliar surroundings, but to him, lingering in a way that suggested she was trying to understand not where she was, but why she was here at all. "Why did you come back?" she asked at last, her voice still soft, but steadier now, the question simple, yet it carried a weight that reached further than the moment itself. Alexander did not answer immediately, his expression unreadable as he held her gaze, because the truth was not something easily spoken, not something he had fully understood himself. The storm had given him every reason to leave her behind, every justification he had relied on for years, and yet he had turned back. He had chosen something different, something he could not explain even now. His eyes flickered briefly to the pendant, once more before returning to her face, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the certainty he usually carried. "I am still asking myself that," he said, and for the first time, there was no finality in his words, no clear boundary to end the conversation, only the quiet acknowledgement that whatever answer existed had not yet revealed itself. And Clara, instead of pressing further, simply watched him, as though she understood that some truths were not given, but uncovered, slowly, over time. And in that shared silence, something shifted again, not dramatically, not enough to be named, but enough to be felt, as if the distance between them had changed in a way neither of them could reverse. The hours that followed did not move as time usually did. They stretched, slow and deliberate, shaped more by quiet observation than by action. And in that quiet, Clara began to notice things she had not seen before, not just the room or the warmth that surrounded her, But the man who had brought her into it, Alexander, did not leave, though he had every reason to, though his presence carried the weight of someone accustomed to command, to distance, to a life untouched by interruption. He remained, not close enough to crowd her, yet never far enough to disappear, as if something invisible held him there just beyond reach. She watched him when he thought she did not, the stillness in his posture, the way his gaze often drifted not outward but inward, as though he were measuring something unseen, something that had shifted the moment he chose not to ride past her in the storm. And it unsettled her in a way she could not name, because she understood silence, she understood restraint. But this was something different, something that mirrored her own quiet in ways she was not prepared to confront. She turned her gaze away at last, her attention returning to the pendant resting against her collarbone, her fingers tracing its edges slowly, instinctively, as if grounding herself in its familiar presence. The metal had warmed now, no longer cold against her skin, yet it seemed to hold something deeper than simple warmth, something tied to memory, to a past. She had not yet spoken aloud, and when she looked up again, she found him watching that small movement, his expression unreadable, but his focus unmistakable. "It matters to you," he said, not a question, but a quiet observation, his voice steady, yet softer than it had been before. Clara hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because the truth felt heavier than the moment allowed. Her grip tightened slightly before she finally nodded. "It is all I have left," she replied, her voice calm, without self-pity, without dramatics, simply a fact spoken into the space between them. And something in those words shifted the air again, subtle, but undeniable. Alexander did not respond immediately, his gaze lingering on the pendant as though searching for something beyond its surface, something that did not belong to her alone. And when he finally spoke, his tone carried a quiet edge of recognition he could not fully conceal. "Where did you get it?" The question came more quickly than he intended, sharper than the stillness they had settled into. Clara stilled at once, her eyes lifting to meet his, something guarded flickering beneath her calm exterior, not fear, not distrust, but caution, as if the answer to that question carried consequences she had not yet measured. She studied him for a long moment, weighing not just the words, but the way he had asked them, the way his composure had shifted, however slightly. And in that moment, she understood something he had not said, that this was not simple curiosity, that whatever tied him to that small piece of metal ran deeper than coincidence. Her fingers curled more firmly around it, instinctive, protective, and when she spoke, her voice remained even, but quieter now, more deliberate. "It was given to me," she said, offering no more than that. Not yet, not until she understood what he was truly asking. Alexander held her gaze, the tension between them no longer unspoken, but not yet defined, because he knew she was withholding something, and she knew he was searching for it. And in that silent exchange, something changed again, not breaking the fragile connection between them, but deepening it, complicating it, turning it into something neither of them could ignore. And for the first time since she had awakened, Clara felt it clearly, that whatever had brought her here was not only about survival. It was about something else entirely, something that had not yet revealed its full shape, but was already beginning to draw them closer in ways neither of them had chosen. The space between them no longer felt neutral. It carried a quiet tension that neither of them attempted to break, and yet neither turned away from it. Clara's fingers remained wrapped around the pendant, her posture still, composed, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held herself now, a guarded awareness that had not been there before. While across from her, Alexander stood with the same measured stillness, though something beneath it had changed, something less certain, less controlled than the man he had been before the storm. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before drifting away, as if he had reached the edge of something he could not yet cross. The silence stretched, not empty, but waiting, and in that waiting, Clara made a quiet decision, not spoken, not even fully formed, but felt, because she understood something he did not yet say, that whatever he saw in that pendant was not coincidence, and whatever it meant, it was not safe to reveal too quickly. Her hand loosened slightly, though she did not release it, instead letting it rest against her collarbone as if nothing had changed. Her voice when she spoke again was softer, but steady. "You have not asked my name." The words were simple, but they shifted the moment, drawing it away from the tension of unanswered questions into something more grounded, something human. Alexander looked back at her, his expression unreadable for a fraction of a second before something almost resembling acknowledgement crossed his features, as if the omission had been deliberate, or perhaps instinctive. "Names can wait," he said quietly. Though his tone carried less certainty than before, Clara studied him, not challenging the statement, but not accepting it fully either, because she recognized avoidance when she heard it, even in a man who spoke so little. She let a breath pass slowly before answering, her voice calm, almost distant. "Clara," she said, offering it without ceremony, without expectation, simply placing it between them as a fact that could not be undone. The name settled into the room, subtle but significant, and for a moment, Alexander did not respond, as if he were testing how it felt, how it changed the shape of what stood before him. "Clara," he repeated at last, the sound quieter than expected, as though it carried more weight than a name should, and something about the way he said it made her still, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because there was something in his voice that did not belong to this moment alone, something that echoed beyond it, faint but undeniable. Her eyes searched his face again, more carefully this time, looking not for answers, but for patterns, for something familiar that should not have been there, and for the first time, she felt it clearly, not just the tension, not just the curiosity, but the beginning of something deeper, something that neither of them had chosen, yet neither could dismiss. Alexander turned slightly then, as if breaking the moment before it could settle too deeply, his attention shifting toward the window where the storm had finally begun to clear, the sky still gray, but no longer oppressive, the world outside quiet in the aftermath, and yet inside, the quiet had changed. It no longer belonged to solitude, but to something shared, something forming, and though neither spoke it aloud, both of them understood, in their own way, that whatever had brought them together was not finished. It had only just begun to reveal itself, and neither of them would walk away unchanged. The quiet that followed his turning away did not end the moment between them. It only shifted it into something less visible, something that lingered beneath every breath and every glance. Clara watched him as he stood by the window, his figure outlined against the pale gray light, distant yet undeniably present, and for the first time since she had spoken her name, she felt the weight of her own silence more clearly, because names had a way of changing things, of making what was temporary feel real, and what was real harder to escape. Her fingers brushed the pendant again, slower now, more thoughtful, as if tracing its edges might reveal answers she was not ready to face. The room held its warmth, but something within her remained unsettled, not from fear, but from the growing awareness that this place, this moment, this man, were not separate from whatever had brought her into the storm, and she could not ignore that feeling any longer. "You knew something when you saw this," she said at last, her voice soft but direct, the question no longer hidden behind caution. Alexander did not turn immediately, his posture remaining still as if the words had reached him before he was ready to receive them. A few seconds passed, measured and deliberate, before he finally looked back at her, his expression controlled, but not untouched. "I thought I did," he replied, the words careful, chosen, though they did not carry the certainty she might have expected. Clara held his gaze, her own steady, unflinching, as though she was no longer willing to let the silence protect them both. "And now?" she asked, the question quiet, but it carried something deeper, something that reached beyond curiosity into something closer to truth. Alexander stepped away from the window then, the distance between them closing just enough to shift the air again, not enough to intrude, but enough to be felt. His eyes dropped briefly to the pendant before returning to her face, and for a moment, the silence returned, heavier now, filled with what neither of them had yet said. "Now I am not certain of anything," he answered, and there was something different in his voice this time, something that did not belong to the man who had once lived by certainty alone. Clara absorbed his words without reaction, but something in her expression softened, not in trust, not yet, but in understanding, because uncertainty was not something she feared, It was something she had lived with far longer than safety. Her gaze drifted briefly, as if considering whether to speak again, and when it returned to him, there was a quiet resolve behind it. "Then we are the same," she said simply, and the truth of it settled between them with a weight neither could deny, because in that moment, the distance between their worlds felt smaller than it should have, not erased, but bridged by something neither had expected. Alexander studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand how someone who had been left alone in the storm could still speak with such calm, such steadiness, and for the first time, the question shifted within him, no longer why he had saved her, but who she truly was, and whether the answer would change everything he believed about the past he had left behind. Outside, the last remnants of the storm faded into stillness, the sky beginning to clear, but inside, the quiet remained, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but waiting, as if something just beyond their understanding had begun to take shape, something that would not allow either of them to return to who they had been before this moment. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both felt it clearly, that the truth was no longer something they could avoid. It was something they were already moving toward, whether they chose to or not. The quiet understanding between them did not dissolve, it deepened, settling into something that neither words nor distance could undo. And yet with that understanding came a shift, subtle but undeniable. Clara no longer looked at him as a stranger who had saved her, and Alexander no longer saw her as a burden brought in from the storm. Something else had taken root, something that made every moment feel more deliberate, more significant than it should have been. Clara drew a slow breath, her strength returning in quiet increments. Enough now that the weight of silence felt heavier than the effort of speech. Her gaze remained steady on him as she spoke again, this time without hesitation. "If you are not certain, then you must have believed something before." The words were calm, but they carried a quiet insistence, not demanding, but unwilling to retreat. Alexander did not answer immediately, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. As if the question had reached further than she intended, his eyes drifted once more to the pendant, then away, as though looking at it too long would confirm something he was not prepared to face. The fire crackled softly behind him, filling the pause, but it did not ease the tension that had begun to gather. "There was a time," he said at last, his voice measured, controlled, yet quieter than before, "when I believed I had lost everything that mattered." The words settled into the room with a weight that did not belong to this moment alone. Clara listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened, because she understood what it meant to carry something lost and unresolved. "And that pendant," he continued, his gaze returning to her, though there was something distant in it now, something pulled from memory rather than the present. "It is not identical, but it is close enough to make me question what I thought I knew." Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the pendant, not in fear, but in recognition that whatever connection he saw was not imagined. Her voice, when it came, was softer, but no less steady. "Then perhaps what you lost was not as gone as you believed." The words were simple, but they shifted something in him, something he had kept sealed away for years. Alexander's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in resistance, because hope was not something he allowed himself to consider, not anymore. And yet standing here, looking at her, hearing her speak with such quiet certainty, he could not dismiss the possibility as easily as he once would have. He turned slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of the table beside him, grounding himself in something solid, something known. "Or perhaps," he replied, his voice lower now, more guarded, "it is only coincidence, and I am searching for meaning where there is none." Clara studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering, as if she could see through the distance he tried to place between them, and then, slowly, she shook her head, not in defiance, but in quiet disagreement. "You did not turn back for coincidence," she said, her voice steady, certain, and the truth of it struck deeper than he expected, because it was not a question, not a theory, but a statement that left no room for denial. Alexander held her gaze, the silence returning, but now it carried something sharper, something closer to realization, because he knew she was right. He had not turned back because of chance. He had turned back because something had called him to, something he had not understood in the moment but could no longer ignore. and as that understanding settled, the distance between them shifted once more, no longer defined by uncertainty alone, but by something that was beginning to take shape, something that tied the storm, the pendant, and the past he had tried to bury into a single, undeniable thread. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both felt it clearly, that whatever truth lay ahead would not only change what they knew about each other, it would change everything they believed about themselves. The truth did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like something long buried beginning to surface through layers of time and silence. And as it did, Alexander felt the weight of it settle into every measured breath he took. Clara's words lingered between them, steady and unyielding, refusing to be dismissed, and for the first time in years, he did not turn away from what they implied. Instead, he stepped closer, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a quiet intention that shifted the space between them, the distance narrowing just enough to make the moment feel inevitable. His gaze moved again to the pendant, no longer avoiding it, no longer uncertain in the same way, but searching, deliberate, as though he had reached a point where hesitation no longer served him. "There was a woman," he said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of the authority he wore so easily before, replaced by something more raw, more unguarded. "Years ago, before the life I lead now, before everything changed." The words carried a weight that did not need explanation. Clara listened without interruption, her expression calm, but her attention unwavering, because she understood that this was not something he spoke of lightly. "She wore something like that," he continued, his eyes never leaving the pendant as if it held the memory itself. "Not the same, but close enough that I would recognize it anywhere." Clara's fingers tightened around it again, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement, because she could feel the shift as clearly as he could. The past was no longer distant. It was present, shaping everything that followed. "And what happened to her?" she asked quietly, the question gentle, but it did not soften the truth it carried. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze lifting to meet hers once more, and for a moment, the silence returned, not empty, but heavy with what had not yet been said. "I was told she was gone," he answered finally, the words simple, but the restraint behind them unmistakable, as if the full truth lay just beyond what he allowed himself to speak. Clara held his gaze, her own steady, thoughtful, and then, slowly, she released her grip on the pendant, just enough for it to rest openly against her collarbone. "No longer hidden, no longer shielded." "Then perhaps you were told wrong," she said, her voice quiet, but certain in a way that did not challenge him, only offered another possibility, one he had not allowed himself to consider. Alexander's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the fracture in his certainty, because hope, once introduced, could not be easily dismissed, and yet it was not hope alone that held him there. It was the undeniable connection forming between the woman before him and the memory he had carried for years, a connection he could no longer ignore. He took another step closer, close enough now that the distance between them was no longer defined by space, but by the unspoken questions that remained. His hand lifted slightly, not touching, but hovering near the pendant as if drawn by something he did not fully understand. "Where did you get it?" he asked again, the question softer this time, but no less urgent. Clara did not look away, did not retreat from the moment. Instead, she met his gaze fully, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say. "From my mother," she answered, and with those words, the quiet shifted once more, deepening into something that could no longer be contained, because now the connection was no longer abstract, no longer uncertain. It was real, tangible, and it carried with it the promise of a truth that would change everything. And as Alexander stood there, closer to her than he had ever intended to be, he understood that whatever answer lay ahead, it would not simply explain the past, it would reshape the future in ways neither of them could escape. The words did not fade after she spoke them. They settled, deep and immovable, altering the very air between them in a way neither could ignore. "From my mother." The simplicity of it carried a weight that unraveled years of certainty in a single breath. And for a moment, Alexander did not move, did not speak, as if the world itself had paused to allow the truth to take hold. His gaze remained fixed on her, not with doubt, not with disbelief, but with something far more dangerous, recognition, that he could no longer deny. Clara watched him carefully, not retreating from what she had revealed, but not pressing further either, because she understood that some realizations could not be forced, they had to be faced, and in that silence, she saw it. The shift in him, subtle but undeniable, the rigid control he carried beginning to fracture beneath the weight of what he was beginning to understand. His hand lowered slowly, no longer hovering near the pendant, as if the need to confirm what it represented had been replaced by something far more certain, far more real. Your mother, he repeated, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority that had once defined every word he spoke. Clara nodded once, her expression steady, though there was something deeper in her eyes now, something guarded but not hidden, because she knew what this meant. Not fully, not completely, but enough to feel the change it had brought. Alexander turned away then, not to escape the moment, but because he needed distance to understand it, to place it within the structure of a past he had long since sealed away. His steps were slow, measured, each one carrying the weight of memory, of questions that no longer remained distant. The room felt smaller now, not in space, but in the way it held everything they had not yet said, everything that had been set into motion the moment she spoke those words. Clara remained where she was, her hands resting lightly against the fabric, the pendant still visible, no longer something she shielded, because whatever it represented was no longer hers alone. It belonged to something larger now, something that connected them in ways neither had chosen. She never spoke of him, Clara said quietly after a moment, her voice softer now, but no less steady, and though she did not say the word, did not name what she implied, it was there, clear in the space between them. Alexander stopped, his back still turned, his posture rigid once more, but not in control, not in certainty. This was different. This was resistance, not to her, but to the truth that had begun to take shape. She only said that some things were better left in silence. Clara continued, her gaze lowering briefly before lifting again. But silence does not make them disappear. The words were not directed at him alone. They carried something of her own past, her own understanding, and that made them impossible to dismiss. Alexander exhaled slowly, the breath heavy, deliberate, as if he were grounding himself in something real before turning back to face her again. And when he did, there was no distance left in his expression, no barrier of indifference. Only the quiet intensity of a man who had reached a point where denial was no longer possible. No, he said, his voice low, steady despite everything that had shifted. It does not. And in that moment, the truth stood between them, not fully spoken, not yet complete, but undeniable in its presence, because whatever had been lost was no longer lost. It had found its way back, not as it once was, not in the form he had known, but in something new. Something that carried both the past and the present within it. And as Clara held his gaze, feeling the weight of what had changed settle into something real, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever came next would not be simple. It would not be easy, but it would not be avoided either, because some truths, once revealed, do not allow themselves to be forgotten, and this was one of them. The room did not feel the same after that moment, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the truth and were now holding it in a quiet, unyielding presence. And Clara felt it settle around her, not as fear, but as something heavier, something that demanded to be faced. She did not look away from him, even as the weight of what they now shared pressed into every breath, because she understood that turning away would not undo it, would not return them to what they had been before the storm, and she had never been one to retreat from what could not be changed. Alexander stood across from her, no longer distant, no longer guarded in the way he had been, but not entirely open either. There was a tension in him now, something caught between acceptance and resistance, as if he stood on the edge of a truth he had not yet fully allowed himself to step into. His gaze moved once more to the pendant, but this time it did not linger in uncertainty. It rested there with recognition, quiet but unmistakable. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something deeper than before, something shaped by memory rather than control. She had a name, he said, the words slow, deliberate, as though saying them aloud required more than he had expected. Clara did not interrupt, her attention fixed on him, her silence an invitation rather than a barrier. "Elena," he continued, and the name settled into the room with a presence that did not belong to the past alone. It felt immediate, as though it had been waiting to be spoken. Clara felt the shift within herself at the sound of it. Not recognition in the way he might have expected, but something quieter, something that echoed through her in a way she could not yet explain. Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric beside her, grounding herself as she considered what to say, what to reveal, because she knew now that whatever connection existed between them was not accidental, not fleeting. It was something rooted in a past she had only just begun to understand. "My mother's name was Eleanor," she said at last, her voice steady, though there was a quiet tension beneath it. "But she told me once that it was not always so." Alexander's gaze sharpened at once, the distance between past and present narrowing further, his attention fixed entirely on her now. "She said she changed it," Clara continued, her eyes holding his, unflinching, "because the life she left behind could not follow her into the one she chose." The words settled heavily, each one drawing a clearer line between what had been and what now stood before him. Alexander took a step forward, the movement unplanned, instinctive, as if something within him had pulled him closer without permission. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but carrying an urgency he no longer concealed. Clara held his gaze, and for a moment, the silence returned, not empty, but full of what she was about to say, because this was no longer a matter of caution. It was a matter of truth, and truth, once begun, demanded completion. "She said she was not meant to stay," Clara answered, her voice calm, but there was something beneath it now, something deeper, something shaped by years of unanswered questions, that the life she came from would have destroyed everything she hoped to protect. Alexander's breath stilled, the pieces falling into place not all at once, but with a steady, undeniable clarity, because he remembered, not just the woman, not just the loss, but the circumstances that had surrounded it, the silence that had followed, the unanswered questions that had never truly faded. And now, standing here, looking at Clara, hearing her speak with a voice so steady, so certain, he understood something he had not allowed himself to believe for years, that what he had been told was not the whole truth, that what he had accepted as final had never truly ended. And as that realization settled into something real, something undeniable, the distance between them disappeared entirely, not in space, but in understanding, because now there was no separating what had been from what was, no dividing line between past and present. There was only this moment, this truth, and the undeniable connection that bound them both to something far greater than either had expected. And in that moment, Clara felt it too, not as a revelation, but as a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not simply uncover the past, it would reshape everything that followed, and neither of them would walk away from it unchanged. The truth did not shatter the moment. It settled into it, deep and irreversible, like something that had always been there waiting to be seen. And for a long time neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that could return them to what they had been before. Clara sat quietly, the weight of her mother's hidden past now unfolding into something far greater than she had ever imagined, while across from her, Alexander stood as though time itself had slowed around him, every memory he had buried rising with a clarity he could no longer deny. Elena, not lost, not gone, but changed, hidden, and carried forward into a life he had never known, into a daughter he had never met. His breath came slowly, controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to the man he had forced himself to become. He stepped closer, not with hesitation, but with a quiet certainty that had replaced the doubt that once held him back. His gaze met Claire's again, and this time there was no distance in it, no barrier of title or past or uncertainty, only the undeniable truth that stood between them. "She chose to protect you," he said, his voice low, steady, not as a question, but as an understanding that had finally taken shape. Clara nodded once, her expression calm, though her eyes carried the weight of everything she had begun to realize. "She chose to survive," she answered softly, and the distinction mattered, because survival was not the absence of loss. It was the decision to carry it forward, to reshape it into something that could endure. Alexander absorbed her words, the quiet strength in them. And for the first time, the past did not feel like something that had been taken from him. It felt like something that had continued, unseen, beyond his reach, until now. His gaze dropped briefly to the pendant once more, no longer a symbol of uncertainty, but a link, a thread that had led him here through storm and silence and years of unanswered questions. And when he looked back at her, there was something new in his expression, not just recognition, but resolve. Then whatever was lost, he said slowly, was not lost completely. Clara held his gaze, the truth of it settling into her just as deeply, because she had lived her life with fragments, with half answers and quiet warnings, and now those fragments were forming something whole, something that could no longer be ignored. The fire beside them burned steadily, its warmth filling the space that had once been defined by distance, and yet neither of them moved away, because leaving this moment meant stepping into something neither had planned for, something neither could fully understand yet. And still, neither turned away, because the connection between them was no longer fragile, no longer uncertain. It was real, shaped by truth and choice and the undeniable pull of something that had begun long before either of them stood here. Clara drew a slow breath, her strength returning, not just to her body, but to something deeper within her, something steadier, more certain, and when she spoke again, her voice carried that quiet strength. What happens now? The question was simple, but it held. Everything, the past, the present, the unknown future waiting just beyond this room. Alexander did not answer immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer was no longer something that could be given lightly. It was something that would shape everything that followed. His gaze remained on hers, steady, unwavering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that had not been there before. Now, he said quietly, we stop living in what was lost. The words settled between them, not as an ending, but as a beginning, because whatever had brought them together in the storm had not been chance. It had been something far more deliberate, something that had waited through time and silence to be found. And as Clara held his gaze, feeling the truth of that settle into something real, she understood one thing with absolute clarity: some lives are changed in a single moment, and some are changed by the quiet choices that follow. And this was only the beginning.